All right. Hi. So first of all, I wanted to use some of my time to thank HCRI for the opportunity to be here and Bertram for the invitation. I'm going to talk briefly about autonomous weapon systems. Autonomous weapon systems, just to make sure we're all on the same page, are weapon systems that can independently select and engage targets. Is that better? And that's based on both the weapon systems with the capability, doesn't mean they have to be used in that mode. And they do this based on gathered information from the environment, as well as, of course, pre-programmed constraints. They're not drones. It's a common misconception. They're not landmines. I'm happy to talk about that, those distinctions later. But the important thing is that drones, as most people think about them, are remotely operated often. Certainly there's the possibility of autonomous drones in the future, whereas landmines are entirely predictable in how they act, as opposed to autonomous weapon systems, which have some X factor. They're not entirely predictable in how they're going to interact with their environment. They might be mostly predictable, but there's a bit of an X factor. The other thing to be aware of is that autonomous weapon systems are in use today. So the Center for New American Security put out a report tracing about 30 different countries that are using weapons with varying degrees of autonomy today. According to this definition, different people use different definitions, and that's why I wanted to start at a sort of same spot. Okay. Wendell's point or slide about ethics trying to keep up with science is often something that's attributed to law. That there are all these new legal questions that are being raised by new technologies, and law is the common sort of understanding is that law is constantly scrambling to keep up. And part of the point of this talk is to emphasize the different ways in which law already has built-in ways of keeping up, and then simultaneously areas where it is scrambling. So autonomous weapon systems obviously raise a host of ethical, strategic, political concerns. Right now, I'm going to talk a little bit about a legal one, and I want to thank Wendell for distinguishing law from ethics and policy, because I want to focus just on the legal question of who do you hold accountable, or which entity do you hold accountable when an autonomous weapon system does something that looks like a war crime? And you can imagine a lot of different ways something could happen, right? You could have a normal accident, the result of some complex system interacting with another complex system in unexpected ways that results in a problem. You could have mistaken misuse, a system that was meant for use in one environment being used in another. Intentional misuse, of course, is always a risk and a problem and a concern. And then you have this new kind of problem, which is that these weapon systems might be particularly susceptible to spoofing or hacking in a way that a sword is not. So this is the technical definition, scary new technologies. Law has three general responses to scary new technologies. The first is we should ban it. If we ban it, we don't have to worry about any of the new problematic legal questions that arise. And it's a very common one. The question is it going to be possible to ban? There are lots of good arguments for why a ban on autonomous weapon systems is a good idea. There are a lot of practical arguments why I don't think it's going to actually be a possibility. So I wrote, not going to go through all these now, wrote a paper a couple of years back where I did a study of different weapons bans over history and evaluated which ones were successful, which ones were not, and drew out a lot, obviously, of factors that supported the likelihood that a given ban would be successful. Then applied this to autonomous weapon systems and found that generally some of them were irrelevant or inconclusive for autonomous weapon systems. The arguments went both ways, and that a lot really did not support the likelihood of a ban on autonomous weapon systems. Okay, so if ban is not an option for autonomous weapon systems, what's law's second response? It's to say everything's going to be okay. We've got a lot of tech-neutral rules out there. We'll just apply them. We'll rely on the wisdom of the ages, the tried and true approaches, and we'll just apply it in this new scenario using law by analogy. This is really going to work just fine for some problems, like the problem of intentional misuse, going back to the original question. We have a lot of law about what happens when weapon systems are intentionally misused for problematic purposes. We can take all of that law and we can apply it to autonomous weapon systems. The problem is other questions, like how do you handle accidents? That's really going to depend on what the right analogy is. And there's no consensus about what the right analogy is for autonomous weapon systems. And determining what the right analogy is will determine the applicable legal regime. So here are a couple potential legal analogies for autonomous weapon systems. One is they're just weapons. They're like other weapons. And we've got a law of war that says certain kinds of weapons are lawful based on their design. Other ones are unlawful. The problem is that doesn't quite work for autonomous weapon systems because they are unlike any other weapon systems in their autonomous nature. So there's something fundamentally different about it. The analogy doesn't quite hold. The other common analogy is that, oh, no, they're combatants, they're robotic soldiers. And then so everyone loves to go to the Terminator, right? I want to make the point, the Terminator is not an autonomous weapon system. Target was chosen for it. Right? This is a semi-autonomous weapon system. My personal favorite fictional autonomous weapon system is Lieutenant Commander Data. But okay, so the problem with thinking about autonomous weapon systems as combatants is that the law of combatants assumes that you can control the behavior of human beings through training on the front end and the threat of punishment on the back end. That doesn't translate well to autonomous weapon systems. Are you going to lock it up? Like, it doesn't really work. You can't take that legal regime and apply it and expect the same results. So then I played around with what are some of the other analogies. And one option is child soldiers. Another option is animal combatants. Both of these are interesting because these are entities that have participated on the battlefield for hundreds, thousands of years in different ways. They are autonomous. They are not held accountable for their actions often. The problem is, for child soldiers, they're banned, not for the same reason we want to ban autonomous weapon systems. We ban them to protect the children, obviously. We're not as concerned about protecting the autonomous weapon systems, though query Kate Darling's work on this. Animal combatants, that seems like a pretty good analogy, actually. The problem with that as a legal analogy is there's no law. There's no rules regarding the use of animal combatants. There's one treaty provision in one treaty that says you can't hide booby traps in an animal carcass. So that's not really useful. So, okay, of law's 3 responses, banning them, I don't think it's going to work. Existing law will cover some problems, but the more helpful the analogy, the less helpful the actual law in the books is for thinking about how to regulate them. And the other problem with analogies is that they're inherently limiting. All of those potential analogies were embodied. The vast majority of autonomous weapon systems are probably going to be cyber-autonomous weapon systems. And so thinking in terms of analogy limits how we think about the possibilities of what we're regulating in some potentially really problematic ways. Okay, so the third option is, all right, then we just need new law. And I think, there's benefits and cons to trying to regulate something that you don't fully understand. But we're in a situation where I think that is the best case scenario for figuring out how to address the problems raised by autonomous weapon systems. So going back to this question of accountability, problems we don't really have answers to is what do you do when a weapon system is hacked and completely controlled by an enemy? How do you hold someone accountable for that? I don't have an answer for that one. And they also have this other new problem of the accountability of there's an increased likelihood of harm of these accidents happening as a result of the use of this weapon system with no one acting intentionally. Historically, most things that look like war crimes happen because somebody was acting intentionally at some point. And then you get into questions of command responsibility and who's responsible for giving orders and who's responsible for following orders and what degree should we divide the responsibility between these individuals. Autonomous weapon systems raise the possibility of these huge problems happening with no one acting intentionally along the line. And so I propose we need new law. We need a new liability regime. We need to get out of this way of thinking about it in terms of criminal law, which is really tied to that combatant analogy. And we need to think about it in terms of state responsibility. And states are generally not held very accountable for the accidents that occur in wartime. And so what I propose in a recent paper is that we really need to rethink that structure to account for this new kind of accident that's likely to occur and impose strict liability on states for accidents that occur in wartime. And so you can see how this is a way that new technology pushes law forward. If this idea gets traction for autonomous weapon systems, it could then expand to include more kinds of state liability for other kinds of accidents that occur in wartime. And so that last point that I want to make is that going back to the political cartoon of ethics chasing after science, so often the relationship between law and new technology is portrayed as technology happens and then law is this like light overlay that happens as a result of that new technology. And it's really much more of an iterative process, that law creates a situation where certain kinds of new technologies are valued and created and developed, and then technology influences the development of the law to address the new problems raised by the new behaviors and capabilities made possible by these new technologies. So I see that as hopeful, because that means there's a lot more possibility for different actors to intervene at different stages in the process. All right, thank you so much.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'll try to talk like a New Yorker very quickly. So we've already sort of talked about this issue of how technological change is affecting inequality. And here, just to give you yet another picture on this, is a time series of the income share of the top 10% in the United States. So you see that we're now at a level, by that metric, of inequality that we haven't been in since prior to the Great Depression. And the trend is kind of going up still. There are lots of sources of this. It's not all about technology. So I teach a whole course on this. We could talk about trade. We could talk about changes in bargaining power between workers and firms, various government policies, the financial sector, and so on. But technological change is part of the story, and that's what I'm going to focus on today. And I want to put on the table from the very beginning that I also study economic growth, and with that hat on, I understand that technological change is the primary driver of long-run economic growth. So I think we just have to accept that technological change is good in that it expands the pie and makes us all richer on average, but it is bad for some people. There are losers, and that's what I'm going to want to be thinking about today. So there's the official definition of robots, which I cribbed from Wikipedia. I should not talk about this to you folks. I'm going to claim, and someone can take this up in the Q&A or over lunch, that the economic effects of robots are, to a first approximation, not really different from the economic effects of lots of other technologies that replace humans or supplement humans in the productions of goods and services. And here's just sort of a list of all sorts of technology that's eliminated jobs, replaced people in the past, and sort of these are some of the ones going forward. That all seems pretty standard. Okay, so let me give you a super brief economic analysis of this. And I'm going to start sort of at the microeconomic level, thinking about a particular industry. So we come up with a better way of producing economics lectures. You record me and put me on everyone's computer or something like that. So if you ask an economist what determines wages of people within an industry, the answer is that the wage is related to the value marginal product of labor. How much extra money my firm gets from employing me for one additional hour. What happens when we have technological change in an industry? So we raise the amount of stuff that a worker can produce. Well, the first effect of that is just to lower the price of output, because now I don't have to pay as much wages to get my bolt of cloth or whatever. The reduction in price is going to raise the quantity of output produced. That's because we have demand curves. That may raise or lower the number of workers employed. So for those of you who remember those things, that depends on the price elasticity of demand. So when we lower the price, how much more of the stuff is demanding? And there are many cases where we become more productive and stuff becomes cheaper, and an industry expands because now everyone wants to buy the thing that was previously too expensive. What's important is that In the long run, this kind of productivity change in a single industry does not affect the wage, and that's because ex ante there's labor mobility, so people can go into different jobs. So if you need an example to think about, I always tell my students about farmers versus barbers. Those are two jobs that require roughly the same amount of human capital. If we go back 100 years, there were lots and lots of farmers. There's been massive technological change in farming. There's been very little technological change in barbering. The relative wages of farmers and barbers haven't really changed. What's happened is just a lot fewer people have gone into farming because there was less demand for them. So if we think about change in a single industry through this lens, it doesn't seem to be much of a problem, unless the speed of structural change is too high, or if you happen to be one of the people whose job is disappearing. And here's just sort of some benchmarks about what I mean by structural change. So you can see in this 100-year period in the US, the share of the labor force in agriculture declines by 5% per decade. 10% of the labor force works in manufacturing now. So you might think, gee, it can't be that bad if we get rid of all these people over the next decade. That'll kind of be a historical rate. But of course, there's things like this Oxford study that say 47% of jobs are at risk for automation. So maybe that's a lot of technological change. I'm going to skip all of this because I realize I have much less time than I thought, other than to say that here I'm going to talk about production functions. It's important to understand that robots, as I'm thinking about them, are not actually an eventual factor of production. Output is produced by skilled workers and unskilled workers and people who save money, and that gets used for capital. Robots are an intermediate good along that chain. So to think about taxing robots is not really that sensible. What you really are going to tax in the end are the rich people who fund them, the skilled people who create them, and so on. Here was my whole narrative of this fantastic book, Golden and Cats, about education and technology. I'm going to just take you straight to the bottom lines from that. Well, these are two important things. The 19th century technology was unskill biased, so machines and unskilled workers replaced skilled workers. Since 1900, technology has been skill biased, which is to say that skilled people and machines have replaced unskilled workers. We think that's going to happen going forward. That's all my beautiful pictures about that. This is a great picture. Just to explain it in 2 words, what Golden and Cats say is, look, over the course of most of the 20th century, we had skill-biased technological progress that would have raised the wage of skilled workers. But we also had a skilling of the labor force. So we greatly raised the ratio of skilled to unskilled workers. And that undid the effect of skill-biased technological change in terms of the relative wages of skilled and unskilled workers. That's why their book is called The Race Between Skills and Education and Technology. Unfortunately, in the last part of the 20th century, technology continued its advance, and we slowed the rate of skill growth, particularly men slowing the rate at which they were attending college. And that led to this explosion of the college high school wage premium, which is sort of one measure of the skill bias in the labor market. Okay, so the takeaway from Golden and Cats, we should just educate more people and everything's fantastic. What else can we do? Well, the other thing we can do is we can have the government redistribute income. These are some pictures showing you that the government does redistribute income. Income inequality has risen over the last several decades. Basically, the level of redistribution has been constant. If we want to fix growing inequality, we could just redistribute a lot more. And here are sort of some proposals for that. So you see discussion of a robot tax as a way of slowing redistribution. Maybe we can think about taxing high-income people more generally. There are a lot of problems. I mean, so Silicon Valley people talk about universal basic income. I'm perfectly happy with the idea. There are some problems with it. First of all, rich people don't like having their money taxed away to be given to everyone else in the world. And then there's what's sometimes been called the dignity deficit, that in fact just giving people money, saying, you know, you're an unskilled person, you don't really have a high market wage, here's some bucks for you, does not make them feel very good. Here are my 4 pieces of literature everyone should read. I'm just going to flash through them. Keynes' Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren is a lovely short essay. Kurt Vonnegut, Player Piano. You cannot be in this business if you have not read this book. It is about wonderful technology making the world miserable and very much about the dignity deficit. This you might not know, Edward Bellamy, Looking Backward, a utopian novel from the 19th century. It's a lovely utopian novel until you read it closely and you realize it's basically totalitarian society. And then there's Ayn Rand, Atlas Shrugged. got to read that as well. It's Paul Ryan, one of Paul Ryan's 3 favorite books. You should know who's running the country. I don't have the time, so I will not play you Mitt Romney talking about the 47%. There's the fundamental picture to think about for income redistribution. Income is distributed in a very skewed fashion so that the mean is higher than the median. In a democratic society, the median voter is always going to want to tax and redistribute, and a lot of political economy is about rich people trying to stop that from happening. Last slide. Okay, here's how things can play out. Technology continues to outrace education. That can lead to inequality of productivity and inequality of economic status. So that's kind of where we seem to be heading. Or we can have inequality of productivity, so only smart people like us produce a lot, but there's a lot of redistribution, either through democratic processes or through non-democratic processes. Not so good. Maybe technology won't outrace education because technology slows down. Again, not so good, because then we don't get the fruits of faster technological progress. Or technology doesn't outrace education because education speeds up, either because we get better institutions for educating people, good luck with that, or because the technology for educating people gets better, and that allows people to keep up. So for you AI people out there, if you want to save the economy, this is what we need, robot teachers. Thank you.
Can I make a request? Can you reset my thing?
So you don't get bothered by the epilepsy?
No, I was actually thinking it reminds me, and when you argue in front of a court of appeals, they put this little box in front of you, and it's like, it's making me feel like I'm in front of the Supreme Court or something. Yeah, I know.
Well, thank you for that respect.
I know. Take you all very seriously.
So how about the greens?
I know, this is lovely. I don't have actually fancy slides or anything. I just kind of wanted to talk really generally, and it kind of actually bridges a lot of David and Rebecca and Wendell's ideas, because I'm a lawyer, but I also did cognitive psychology. I do cognitive psychology, and the thing that strikes me most about emerging technology and new technology is that when we think about how to regulate it, we think of law. That is our first answer. And I mean, Rebecca kind of spoke to this. But actual law governs very little of our lives, and we mostly rely on norms and how we function in daily society, and that's all done in the shadow of law. So you don't actually expect a law to come down and be enforced upon you for the most part, but we've created all of these kind of limits for ourselves and boundaries within that. And so I think that in areas of robotics, autonomous vehicles, AI, the internet, autonomous weapon systems, and algorithms, this is particularly evident. And the other thing about all of those areas is that they're also created mainly by private companies and in private industry. And so I guess what I recently have argued is in the area of the internet and speech is that these private actors are within the bounds of law, with law's kind of the shadow, have created all of these norms, or reflect back to us our norms, and have created these rule sets that we're governed by. And specifically, I'm speaking to online platforms like Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter, and how they kind of control our speech. And so I guess the only thing, this is just very short, that the only thing that I kind of was going to put out there, and I will be the norms person on the panel, econ law norms, that we are not always that we're not always beholden to the law in understanding how all of this is going to play out, and that being aware of the role that all of these private actors have in establishing and reflecting our norms and our governance structures as these things develop is a super important part of the puzzle, and one that is often invisible or that we don't spend a lot of time thinking about, and can often be the answer to how a lot of these technologies and our responses to them are shaped. There you go. Look, I have all this time left.
Wow.
I know.
Thank you.
I know.
Get the morning prize. We don't have Best Paper Award. Best Paper Award. All right, where's our box? Selma, please. Can I throw? Yes, please. All right, I'll try that.
Wow.
All right, so Thank you all. Appreciate the informative talks. My question's about kind of the increase in technology relative and the skills gap. To what extent do you feel like the increase in technology lowering the barrier to entry to different different areas of production, how that impacts inequality? For instance, one of the reasons that software development and computer science is so popular right now is because the barrier to entry is lower. You can teach yourself to program and get a good paying job. And so that is, makes a lot of students very interested in computing. And everybody wants to build an app these days. So when we build things like better human-computer interfaces, to what extent does that advance in technology impact inequality? Could you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. I think that's a very good question. It's certainly true that I don't want to make it sound like sort of all technological progress is raising inequality, because you're absolutely right. The low barriers to entry in software, or I think going forward just a few years, the fact that a world-class education is going to be accessible to many, many people, both in the United States and elsewhere, via their computers and MOOCs and open courseware and all that, is really great and does raise mobility. Now, what it does to inequality is a little unclear, because first of all, I think it's great when people can do that and write their own apps, but I think if you look at sort of the US labor force or the US population, there's still a large number of people who are not going to reach that stage. And then in particular, yes, we all want to write our own apps and we all want to work in computing and stuff like that. But of course, the essence of a lot of these businesses is that they have zero marginal costs, right? So, someone's going to write, some person who has very little capital and very few barriers to entry is going to write a fantastic app, and we're all going to use it, to play on our iPhones or whatever. And that person is going to become a zillionaire and we'll all be very happy. But there can't be a lot of people like that. I mean, these are all kind of winner-take-all industries. And this is something, one of the other drivers of inequality more generally is something that the economist Sherwin Rosen called the superstar phenomenon. And just to sort of give one example of that, an example he gives is if you think of comedians. So if you go back 50 or 60 years, there were many people who could make a living as a comedian, because if you were a comedian, you just talked to one room at a time, and there were thousands of people who wanted to be entertained, so there were hundreds of comedians who traveled around making a living as comedian. Now we have media technology, which is great. The best comedians can reach vast audiences, and none of us want to watch the 100th best comedian. And so we've kind of raised inequality in that. And a lot of information technology things have that same feeling, this kind of superstar setup.
I think Peter. All right, let's try this.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you for all those talks. And thanks to Kate for bringing up this issue or question about norms. I think it was a couple wee robots ago I did a paper on the norm gap, right? And that's really the challenge, is where do we come up with norms? So I want to try to dig down a little bit into this question in terms of actually autonomous weapons and Rebecca's talk. And you had the sort of three possible responses being ban, leave the law as it is, or new regulation. And I want to sort of question this distinction on the one hand between a ban and new regulation, or what constitutes the new regulations. I mean, a ban could be a regulation. But if you start thinking about it in terms of the positives and the norms, one of the challenges, of course, with any new technology is there's no established practice necessarily, because it doesn't exist yet. So what are the norms? What are the customs in that area? And how do you get there? And I think that's really what Wendell is sort of thinking through, of how to organize all these different institutions globally to start talking about what these norms ought to be and how do we shape and regulate them. But in terms of the autonomous weapons, if we think, and you had the sort of list of things that were potentially criteria for successful bans, and one of those was superfluous injury. And I think that's a really good example, because it's actually a norm, and is a norm that came out of international discussions in the St. Petersburg Declaration, where what we want to do is prevent superfluous injury and unnecessary suffering caused by weapons, and we thereby ban the weapons that do that. Although, you know, we can sort of specify directly, okay, we're talking about dum-dum bullets or explosive bullets in that specific context, but there's a broader normative principle that really emerges from that debate. And I would argue the campaign to stop killer robots and the debates at the CCW so far on this issue of autonomous weapons has led to an emerging norm, potentially, of meaningful human control. And if we establish a regulation that embodies a requirement to ensure meaningful human control, that would seem to directly address the two key concerns about accountability that you raised, and then what happens for unintended or unintentional harms if you then have a duty on the part of states or on the part of militaries, officers, individual operators to ensure that the systems that they're building, deploying, and using have meaningful human control, and if they fail to, that is itself a violation of a norm in some sense.
All right, so there's a lot to unpack there. One thing that I love about international law is that the importance of norms, as you raise, is explicitly recognized. The two main sources of international regulation are treaties, written law, things that look like what we're accustomed in the domestic context to thinking of as law, and customary international law, which is explicitly norms that develop as a result of state practice to the point at which states act as though they are law and believe they're law. So it's really explicit in international law that norms are critically important. I think the discussion that's come out of the campaign's work has been so important. And this concept of meaningful, well, to go back to the superfluous injury and suffering, like that's a norm that was a norm that evolved and then was codified in a treaty. And so it's sort of like doubly powerful now because it's recognized both as customary international law and as treaty law. The concept of meaningful human control, I think, has been a really useful concept that's developed as a result of the conversation that's been started. The problem is it doesn't have the status of a norm yet as a legal matter because we don't have evidence of consistent state practice. So norms are powerful norms are powerful and legitimate to the extent that there's consistent state practice around them, and ideally over an extended period of time. You're going to lose the extended period of time with new technology no matter what, but it matters if all the states are doing the same thing. And my understanding is that different states have taken very, very, very different positions on what constitutes meaningful human control, right? One state says there needs to be a human who's the person actively killing the other person. That's meaningful human control over a weapon system. Another state will say it's sufficient to have a programmer that makes a decision years prior to the actual lethal event. That constitutes meaningful human control. And so I think there's a lot of potential here for discussion and the potential for a norm with the force of law to evolve, but we're going to need to get it's going to need to get narrowed in a bit more. Everyone can agree meaningful human control sounds like a good thing. No one's going to say, no, actually, I want a berserker.
Meaningless.
Right? Yeah, right. But unless we have actual concrete meaning of what does that mean in practice, I don't think it's a norm that's attained the status of law yet.
We have a question over here.
Yes. So I come from kind of an international background. I've lived in China, I lived in South Korea, I've lived in India. And I guess based on my background, I'm interested in how you look at self-regulation by private actors. Because when I think about how private companies try to self-regulate based on their domestic laws, domestic norms, unwritten rules, cultural background, and then exporting the products based on the self-regulation, I feel like there is a kind of a conflict happening. And I was wondering if you could explain a bit more about how this norm is going to create maybe problems later on.
Yeah, I will actually. So that's a fantastic question. That's actually exactly what I've been looking at. So I've been looking at this with Facebook and Twitter and YouTube, and how. So in the United States, these are global companies, but they were created in the United States. And in the United States, we have something called Section 230, which is a code, which is a part of our legal code that has given immunity for liability for online platforms for publishing content. So it used to be that you would sue the New York Times because the New York Times had deep pockets. If someone defamed you in the New York Times, there was a period in time in the early 90s when that was starting to happen on the internet. People were going after AOL every time, someone wrote something on a chat message board. Basically, we decided, and also the internet was full of porn. So they decided that they were going to solve two problems at once, and they were going to give all of these platforms immunity so that they could police or curate their websites, and they could also not be afraid to do that because they might be sued for being editors or as publishers. So that's kind of created the internet as we understand it today, but it's really complicated because it's also created all of this self-regulation in the shadow of this, they keep saying shadow for some reason, but in the shadow of all this immunity. So you have places like Facebook that have all of these really complicated and totally opaque rule sets that they have developed because they have an economic necessity to reflect the norms and expectations of their users, because if people feel safe, they'll post more and they get more eyeballs on their ads and more engagement, and also their sense of corporate responsibility, but they can do that all. And as far as I know, in direct answer to your question, they basically have come up with those norms themselves and enforce them globally, and they're not reflective of, say, India's norms or China's norms or Japan or even Tennessee's norms. They're just reflective of the norms that the people in Menlo Park have decided are going to be the norms that they distribute and enforce globally with these rule sets. And they change on a weekly basis, literally, because that's how norms change. And so that's my understanding of how these companies are self-governing. And I say self-governing, self-regulating, but they're also kind of regulating you. So that's a kind of an important part of it.
I'm going to push back on that.
Really?
Yeah. I don't think norms change on a weekly basis. I think policies.
I think that, I would totally, for example, I don't think that we have until there's, that's what a meme is, right? A meme is like a norm around a picture that we all understand, and it changes like that. You're thinking about norms in kind of this international context, I think.
I would say the norm of memes is that you share certain memes with your friends, right? You share certain memes with your coworkers, right? Any individual meme you would say is a norm?
Yeah. Sorry. But, yeah, sorry.
Perhaps you could just give an example of a norm which changed weekly?
Yeah, okay. So I don't know if you're familiar with this story of Napalm Girl. This was a picture that was from the Vietnam War of a 9-year-old girl running naked from a napalm attack in Vietnam. And it was a very famous photo, won a lot of awards. And that was taken down on Facebook thousands and thousands of times for years. Until a couple weeks ago, months ago at this point, I guess, the Norwegian Prime Minister happened to put it up on Facebook and had it taken down, and had the media, and Sheryl Sandberg stepped in and said, I guess we made a mistake. I guess that, we got this wrong. And when she's saying she got it wrong, she didn't get it wrong. The norm changed. People were suddenly aware of what they wanted to see, and in the context of that, they don't want to see little 9-year-old naked girls. People don't want to see child pornography or necessarily gory war photos. But that norm, the rule changed, but so did the understanding of what the norm was reflected to Facebook, if that makes sense. Facebook wasn't aware that was a norm that they should be reflecting differently in their rules, so they changed their rules. But they had to, I guess maybe you're right. Maybe at the end, maybe you're kind of, what you're saying is kind of that their rules change, but I would say that the norms are constantly also evolving, and so you have to continue to update your rules to reflect the changing norms.
Just to give another example, during the presidential campaign and continued in the last few weeks, the norms of what's acceptable to say, at least acceptable to a large community, has been changing. Almost each time our current president puts up a new Twitter, the question is, thank you, tweet. See, you can tell I'm not doing that. I'm whistling with some limitations. So I think there's a conceptual continuum between norms that often are used to contrast to laws and norms as they're used by, for example, social scientists or psychologists, which are much more flexible, much more context specific, and a single picture can actually constitute a new context with in response to which people's behavior changes. And the idea of a norm is that it guides community behavior, but the communities are usually small. And this is my follow-up to your question to all of you. How in the world can we expect that norms will change these kinds of massive international, privately influenced actions when really how norms normally work is that a community gets together, agrees on something, acts in certain lines, and then has some enforcement mechanism to put the people who are out of line back into line. Whereas in the history of the last 10, 12,000 years, laws have been passed by hierarchical actors, kings and governments that are very, very different. And that's my concern. And if we have to wait for that, that's going to be problematic. And if we have to wait for norms, that's also going to be problematic. So that's my sort of pessimistic view. If you could respond, and then actually, Wendell has another comment there too.
Go ahead.
That is the problem of international law, that there is no hierarchy. And so there are all of these different states that theoretically are equal, practically power-wise, militarily-wise, are not equal, but all participate. The fiction of the important, crucial legal fiction of international law is that all states are equal, and so all states' actions need to be taken into account in constructing new law, that treaty is consent-based. One state can't force another state to sign a treaty, and that customary international law is legitimate because everybody's doing it. And so these are the other mechanisms, and this is why I think it's so grounded in norms of creating new law for new technologies. And it has worked in the past. Like, we do have treaties about difficult new technologies. We do have customary international law about new technologies. There are a lot of particular problems to new technologies that are different from those in the past, and there's going to be a whole panel on this in DC in about a month that if anyone's interested in, talk to me, because it's a fascinating subject.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think that I would say that it's kind of there's also norms in transnational issues. And so these the difference between international being that there's international being kind of like everyone kind of trying to agree on one set of rules, and transnational being like countries working within each other or across like certain types of boundaries. So I think that these corporations in this private question or transnational questions, like I think that like you're just having, in terms of, all I know is the area of speech, and I think that when you have online speech, you're just having kind of a top-down actor deciding which norms they're going to reflect in their rules. They are highly incentivized to reflect the norms that they feel like the people that are on their websites want to see. But I do think that there is some type of like kind of top-down mechanism of establishing policies that reflect the norms that they think are happening.
Wendell and then.
Yeah. My point is really just a continuation of this conversation, because I think we're hitting the nail on the head with this. It seems to me that the issue we're dealing with all of these emerging technologies is whether they really do fit in the past. Nothing is different in terms of the kinds of jobs being replaced, or perhaps something is different in the sense that these are cognitive jobs, and that's where the debate lies. And that all of these technologies are forcing us either to recognize that we are within old norms, or that we have to establish totally new norms. And that if it is new norms, we're in a process of doing that. So when you talk about lethal autonomous weapons, Peter is totally correct. Meaningful human control did not exist before the campaign. But Rebecca is also totally correct. because there is no consensus yet on what meaningful human control is. So we have the new norm, but the debate is whether a general who sends out a lethal autonomous weapons 5 hours ago to find a certain target, was engaged in meaningful human control, or meaningful human control only means being there in real time to authorize the dispatching of a technology. So I think that's what we're getting into in all of these areas. If you think about the trolley car problem, which got so much attention for autonomous vehicles, Gary Marcus here was actually the first one to ever mention that example in one of his New Yorker columns.
Obama stole it from me.
But in any case, there is no answer. There is no correct answer to what the car should do. The only way we're going to have an answer is through either a public dialogue and the establishment that way of a new norm, or the power players are just going to establish a new norm so they can quickly move on and introduce the next technology. Yes.
Do you want to comment, or do you want to just move on to the next point? This should probably be our last point, because we have another talk coming up.
I just wanted to answer something Kate said, which is that actually the reason Facebook was blocking the napalm photograph was because of the laws on publishing child abuse images.
That's not actually true.
No?
No.
That's how it was, okay, that's how it was presented when I read about it.
Yeah, no,
certainly.
it's had nothing to do with it, actually. So
Okay.
that was, child porn is taken down through an automated system called PhotoDNA, but it was not actually about child pornography.
So they didn't consider the fact that she was naked was not the issue?
I think it was a context issue. They thought that it was graphically violent and that it was also that she was naked. It was like it was both.
Okay, thanks.
All right, so let's thank our panel, and then we have one more talk before lunch.